Good morning, everybody. It's 11 o'clock, so I think we'll make a start. And a very warm welcome to everybody who perhaps has joined us just for this session. I know that Les has given a welcome to some participants already, but it's a real pleasure from me as well, Professor Pauline Leonard, one of the directors of the WSI, to welcome you to our summer school on AI for Future Society. So thank you for signing up to what we're sure will be a really interesting, stimulating and inspiring week. That you're all from a very broad variety of disciplinary backgrounds and different histories with different knowledges of and relationships to web science is all to the good, and what makes the week so rewarding. The ways in which you'll come together and debate some of the most topical and challenging issues of the moment, Brexit aside of course. And we're going to be inspired this week by some of the leading scholars and thinkers in the field. We start today with a consideration of what many are positioning as a brave new world achieved through new forms of AI, robotics, machine learning, computational design capabilities, and so on. Much of what's been written about the dramatic social changes that these technologies will augur, with some eulogising these as delivering a wholesale transformation of social inequalities, quality of life and lifestyles, while others, more gloomily perhaps, see their impact as totally dehumanising, destructive of core human capacities such as creativity, imagination, interpersonal communication, skills levels, and satisfaction gained from productivity in all its multiple forms. The future, in effect, is speeding towards us at a time-compressed rate, yet we actually still do not know what this means for societies going forwards. To debate this conundrum more fully, I'm really delighted to welcome Professor Susan Halford from Bristol University. And as many of you know, Susan has a long-standing commitment to interdisciplinary education and research. For the past decade, in particular, across the social and computational sciences. She's well known for her work as an organisational sociologist, in which she's explored the dynamics of organisational change, with particular reference to gender identities and power relations, and also ageing, linking these to the socio-technical practices and effects of digital innovation in the workplace. Since 2008, she's played a central role in the development of interdisciplinary web science as a space where new forms of collaborative knowledge about digital data, methods, and architectures may be pioneered. On a broader landscape, her work explores the politics of digital data, artifacts and expertise, with a particular focus on the place of sociology as a discipline in these new knowledge assemblages. She's co-director of the Bristol Digital Futures Institute, which is a new centre which aims to transform the way we create new technology to benefit society. It's innovative in the way that computational sciences will work together with social sciences to address some of the most big social challenges of the time. And Susan also sits on the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council Programme Advisory Board, on the Cabinet Office Digital Government Partnership, and she's a member of the Advisory Board for the International Social Media and Society Conference. So we're really looking forward to Susan's lecture today. Susan is always a wonderfully stimulating and inspiring talker, really, really good fun to listen to. And I know that she's going to sort of kick us off with lots of ideas which we'll debate once she's finished her lecture. So here's Susan to talk about doing the future differently, artificial intelligence, and the promise of a new responsibility. Thanks, Susan.
Thanks, no pressure then. I'll try and be as fun as I possibly can be on a very, very rainy and Brexity Monday morning. So it's really a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure. It's slightly Groundhoggy Day for some of you who were at my ex-augural lecture, which was very similar to this in this same room. It really is a pleasure to be here, partly, as Pauline said, because the new programme, Artificial Intelligence for Future Society, shares that commitment to interdisciplinary understandings of technology and of socio-technical systems. And that's something that's really very dear to my heart and dear to the heart of web science and of this programme in Artificial Intelligence for Future Society. It's also dear to my heart because I was actually had the opportunity to be involved in the early stages of designing this programme in AI for Future Societies, and it's really lovely to be here at the opening event that launches that programme. As Pauline mentioned, I was at Bristol, I was at the University of Southampton for a long time as part of the Web Science Institute, also as part of the Centre for Doctoral Training in Web Science, and many of those interests, of course, as is the way in academic life, have travelled with me to the University of Bristol, and we're working on some of the same issues as you'll be looking at in Artificial Intelligence for Future Society, so I really hope that we can find ways to connect what you're doing in Southampton with what we're doing in Bristol and join up the thinking across the two institutions. So, in this lecture I want to talk about the future, deliberately in capital letters because that's the way we tend to talk about the future. And I want to talk in particular about artificial intelligence and how artificial intelligence is both embedded in the way that we think about the future and how the future is embedded in the way that we think about artificial intelligence. So these are very bound up with each other in a number of different ways. I want to problematize the future from the outset because the future is deceptively simple sometimes. Sometimes we imagine the future as a kind of empty space where anything can happen, where anything's possible, because it's the not yet. And I want to challenge that idea and to insist that we would be foolish and actually highly irresponsible if we do not pay attention to what we've learned from the past. And two things of particular relevance in this case. The first one is that whatever the promises of technologies, whatever big, bold promises are made, we know from sociologies of past societies and looking back at how sociologists and social scientists have considered the future in the past, if you see what I mean, we know how often that goes very, very badly wrong. We know that predictions and claims about how societies will evolve over time have, for the most part, been quite spectacularly mistaken on a number of different levels. The second thing that we also know from the past and the present is that technologies often, in fact I would probably say almost always, do not turn out to come into use in exactly the way that we imagine that they will. Of course technologies come into use, of course they have big impacts and they have big effects, but very often those impacts and effects were not predicted and have turned out to be rather different to the claims that were made for them by the inventors of the technologies in the first place. Sorry, I'm so bad at keeping up with PowerPoint, I do apologise. The third starting point, so we have the first two starting points. The first one, past failures in predicting future societies. The second one, technical innovation and effects are deeply social, they're not just technical. It might make you think from those first 2 points there that we should not try and look at the future, that we should abandon any idea of trying to understand futures in the present. And in fact, that is a position that has been taken in a number of social science disciplines, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But to the contrary, my argument is that we should not abandon the future. My argument is that instead, we need to think about new ways of future making. We need to face those challenges. We can't pretend that these challenges, number 1 and 2, don't exist, because they do, right? But instead of running away from them and abandoning the future, my argument is that we really need to embrace these understandings and we need to use them to help us to craft different kinds of approaches to making the future. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. This is the outline of the lecture. It's got 4 parts. The first one is to elaborate a little bit on some of those problems in terms of what's wrong with the future. Why am I telling you to be so afraid of the future in some ways? What am I arguing? Hello. The second thing I'm going to do is to talk about how we might actually craft some new principles for thinking about the future. So these are very high-level principles that I'm going to draw from a range of sociological and social science sources to suggest that we can start to think about the future in new ways. And then secondly, in the second two parts of the lecture, I'm going to think about that with regard to artificial intelligence. So first of all, I'm going to look at how the future is mobilised in current representations of artificial intelligence, what the claims are about how artificial intelligence will shape future societies, and how we might think about those claims, really what the problems with some of those claims are. And then in the final part of the lecture, because I'm always the optimist, to be honest, I'm going to think about how we might... Serves me right for being an optimist. I'm going to think about how we might do the future differently. So I'm going to think about how we might think differently about artificial intelligence and how we might work towards what Donna Haraway has called a new response ability to the future, a new ability to respond to the future in constructive and productive ways that transcend some of those earlier problems. So, first of all, what's wrong with the future? And I've got two things to say about what's wrong with the future. There are many other things, but these are the two main things that I want to say. Fundamentally, this first point that I want to make is a question of scientific epistemology. It's a question of how can we know and make claims about the future? On what basis do we claim to have knowledge and understanding of what the future will be? And this is particularly a problem when we think in this interdisciplinary context, because we see some very big differences between the natural sciences, which have a set of principles for thinking about the future, and the social sciences, which are very sceptical and in fact have, over the 20th century in particular, crafted a rather different set of principles from which derives their scepticism about the future. So for all of us who are involved in interdisciplinary thinking, this is a really fundamental challenge. The epistemological differences between the natural sciences and the social sciences is a real issue. I'm deliberately not saying engineering or computing sciences. Actually, my view is that the engineering and computing sciences very largely veer towards the epistemologies of the natural sciences, but also that they have huge potential not to do so and huge opportunities to engage with the social sciences in thinking differently about epistemology. So let me explain what I mean a little bit. Any history of the modern disciplines, if we want to go back to the Enlightenment and look at the modern disciplines as they emerged at that time, will tell you that there is a hierarchy of disciplines. Wendy complained that maths wasn't on this list last time, and look, I still haven't put it on there. That wasn't deliberate. A hierarchy of disciplines underpinned at its foundations with maths and physics. So maths and physics in particular was one of the first modern one of the first disciplines to imagine itself as a discrete discipline during the Enlightenment, and it brought with it the foundations of a particular kind of scientific epistemology, a particular way of understanding how we do scientific research and how we make claims to knowledge. Newtonian physics, in particular, was built on a number of key principles. Sorry, I'm really rubbish with the PowerPoint today. And the key principles were universal laws, prediction, and objectivity as the gold standards for scientific rationality. Now, we could talk a lot about how the period of the Enlightenment was replacing older forms of knowledge around superstition, around religion and so on, and was transforming into a new paradigm for knowledge. And that's really relevant, but we can come back to that in the questions if you like. The keys here were around building universal laws, prediction, and objectivity. And as the new disciplines started to emerge in the same time, a little bit after physics and over the course of the Enlightenment, that scientific epistemology became fundamental to claims to becoming a discipline. So new disciplines emerged which not only said, well, physics looks at the movement of stars, or physics looks at the physical material systems in the world. We have the social sciences that emerged, primarily sociology, politics and economics, which said, well, we don't look at that, we look at social life, we look at political life, we look at economic life. And you start to see a kind of carve-up in which the disciplines created unique spaces for themselves that came to be what we think of as the modern academic subjects in the academy that we are used to. And they did that, as I say, by identifying particular parts of the field that they were researching, but also claims to legitimacy were based on reproducing the scientific rationality that had been laid down by the natural sciences. So in order to be able to claim legitimate knowledge, the social sciences began their history by attempting to reproduce these ideas of universal laws, prediction, and objectivity. Marx, Weber, and Durkheim, we could debate this. There is some different aspects to what they did that were not only about scientific objectivity, but all in various ways sought to reproduce this, to identify universal laws of society, to make claims about how societies would unfold throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, and claims to objectivity, that is, to stand above and be apart from the societies which they were studying. Now, we know that that hasn't really gone so well for Marx, Weber and Durkheim. Marx predicted the inevitability of a workers' revolution that would, in the end, bring about a post-capitalist society. That hasn't happened yet. The revolution in Russia was not led by the workers exactly, and it seems quite unlikely that Marx's prediction of the kind of end point of history is going to happen anytime soon. Similarly, the great theorists of modernity, Weber and Durkheim, also, whilst like Marx, they give us many very valuable concepts, many very valuable theoretical perspectives in terms of their prediction of how modernist societies would evolve, particularly around the globe. They have proven to be really rather flawed, inaccurate, and also to show that many of their starting points were really grounded in a very Eurocentric and Western vision of the world and how it would unfold. Indeed, over the 20th century, social scientists have come to understand both the political strengths of scientific epistemology, that is, the closer you can claim to being able to deliver universal laws, prediction and objectivity, the more status you have as a discipline, and probably the more funding you have as a discipline. In fact, scientific epistemology in this simplistic form has huge weaknesses for understanding social relations and the social world. It might be very good for physics, it might be very good for chemistry. I say might because, of course, physics has come a long way since Newton, and some interesting epistemological changes in physics as well over the 20th century in particular. But if we are studying the social world that human beings make in interaction with each other that are shaped by values, we find it very difficult to suggest that there are any universal laws for those social relationships and those social worlds. We know that time and space make a huge difference in shaping the social world. We know that the social formations, the social practices, the social values that operate across history and operate between different parts of the world are not universal. People make their own worlds, and more than that, unlike rocks and chemicals, I would suggest, people are reflexive about the worlds that they are making. We think about our worlds and we sometimes seek to change them, including based on the research that we read. Some people read. Including based on research that finds its way into a variety of popular understandings, for example. So human beings are reflexive, they think about their world, they seek to change their world, and my point about research is that we as researchers are not somehow above or apart from that, because when we go into the field, when we go in and we talk to people, we research people, we write about the social world, quite possibly we change it. Okay, we cannot be objective and separate and apart from that world in the way that arguably, and again I come back to physics and the disputes in physics, but that arguably you can be if you are in the natural sciences. So, there are no universal laws for society. The predictive possibilities are limited, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Objectivity is impossible, and in fact, I really recommend you read the Gulbenkian Review of the Social Sciences, which was published, I think, in 1990-ish, edited by Emanuel Wallerstein, or written by Emanuel Wallerstein, and which interestingly had a Nobel Prize-winning physicist on the commission. So it's very interesting that the commission ended up concluding fictive neutrality has become the major obstacle in increasing the truth value of our findings. What that means is pretending to be neutral, pretending to be apart from the world that we are studying, actually risks damaging our research findings more than recognising that we are inevitably part of the world that we are studying, making that explicit and dealing with it in a very open kind of way. Okay. So over the 20th century, the social sciences and sociology in particular worked very, very hard to think about what would sociological epistemology look like and what would sociological methods look like. How could we seek to build robust and actionable knowledge of the social world without insisting that we tried to come up with universal laws, prediction and objectivity. And sociology and the social sciences now has built a really good, strong repertoire of methods for researching the social world that transcends those challenges, that deals with some of those problems. So that's the first thing that's wrong with the future, is its grounding in a particular epistemological set of principles, which are very difficult if we're looking at the social world. The second thing that's wrong with the future refers more particularly to technologies and to technical innovation. We know that technologies do not deliver clearly predefined or predictable outcomes. We know that technologies start to have effects when they're used in the world, when people run with those technologies, and we know that what happens with those technologies as they are embedded and as they are taken up and used, or actually interestingly not used, against all predictions, sometimes things are simply not used, it's that take up in practice and the intermixing, the embedding of both technical possibilities and social life, it's the combination of those that changes the world. But we know that it's very difficult to predict exactly how that will work out, and that has great resonance, I think, both for web science, which is in some ways the forerunner of this programme that you are now looking at, and for the programme on artificial intelligence for future societies. I mentioned the web because it's a really great example of how a set of technologies that were anticipated to have a certain outcome have not had exactly those outcomes. They have been rather different to anything that was originally expected by the inventors of the web. And you'll all be familiar with Tim Berners-Lee talking about, or many of you will, talking about how the web has gone wrong. The web has somehow escaped. The web needs controlling, re-engineering. And so this is just a little tiny set of images which show you, does anybody know what this image is? Here. Sure, JP does. This is the first ever diagram of the internet, which shows two computers being joined together, two computers in remote locations being joined together. This is Tim Berners-Lee's original memo in which he proposed a new information sharing system. It wasn't called the web at the time. Very famously, top right-hand corner, his boss wrote vague but interesting. And then we start to see, the web. Tim Berners-Lee at that time did not, I guess he knew that there needed to be browsers, but browsers didn't come until later. Google didn't come until quite a bit later. Certainly Facebook, online shopping, kittens on skateboards, social media, social movements, some of the scandals around the NSA in the US, Snowden, all the rest of it. None of those things were predicted. That wasn't what the web was supposed to do, but it did it, because as the web came into use, as businesses, governments, criminals, educationalists, social movements, you name it, saw the possibilities for what could be done with the web changed the world, and as we used to say in web science, the world changed the web. You couldn't stream videos, you couldn't have user-generated content. You know, the technologies that underpin the web changed over time as well as people started to want to do new kinds of things and see new kinds of possibilities. So that's just one probably over-laboured example of how it's quite hard to predict what particularly disruptive technologies will do once they get out there and people start using them. When we started Web Science, and I think it's the same for this programme here, this was a real touch point for the social scientists and the computer scientists. Okay, that this made it, as I was saying earlier, where do we position engineering and computing in this epistemological battle? This set of circumstances made it possible, I think, for computer scientists and social scientists to talk to each other in a very purposeful way, because on the one hand, the computer scientists were facing kind of inexplicable, not understandable, unaccountable, uncontrollable things happening to their technology. And Les will say this, you know, it's escaped. The technology escaped. People took it and ran away with it, and we didn't know what to do with it. And the sociologists, you know, when they weren't being too pompous and patronising, and that's mainly me, and didn't say, yeah, of course, or we could have told you that, although we did say that sometimes. But we also offered conceptual tools and ways of thinking, empirical evidence for how we could work with that, how we could think about it, how we could come together to think about what was happening with the web, how we'd got there, and where we were in the present. So we could rewrite the history and we could think about what was happening in the present. What was always much more difficult for us was the future, but we didn't really think about the future very much because we were a bit stuck, you know, with quite a few things on our hands really, one way and another, what with the past and the present. The future didn't worry us too much. But that is still an issue. And as data science emerged in the late 2000s, it started to cause problems, I would say, because we have this kind of claim here from data scientists. I really think I'll stop putting this up because it's giving it far too much credibility. But these kinds of claims were made by data scientists. Data science, of course, arose out of the web and the huge quantities of data that were being generated by the web, not only by the web, but largely. And we have these kinds of claims. This is a world where massive amounts of data and maths replace everything else. So what we had were claims from the data scientists that we wouldn't need social sciences anymore. So this epistemological clash that I was describing, in the late 2000s, it looked a bit like it was possible that data science believed, I don't think it ever looked like it was going to happen, data scientists, some of them believed that they would just wipe out the whole of social sciences because all the problems that we had with prediction and objectivity and universal laws had disappeared now because we had all these new forms of data, and these new data were just going to tell us everything about the world. We would know everything, we would understand everything, we would shift into a new paradigm of computational social science where all you needed was maths and data, and that would be enough. And that was a really interesting point, which we could talk about some more. However, I would say that this is very 2008, okay? Data scientists, at least the really great ones that I know at Southampton and at Bristol, do not talk like this anymore. They know that those data are not objective. They know that those data are biased and partial. And they know that those data can tell them some things, but not everything. And that interpretation of those data really requires what they would call domain expertise, what I would call sociology or politics or education or economics or whatever. So I think we've kind of weathered that storm, but what we do have to do, and I'm going to talk about this in a moment, I'm not dismissing these data, and I'm not dismissing the methods that allow us to engage with these data, including what we now call artificial intelligence, but we need to join them together with social science thinking if we're interested in really decent, robust and actionable knowledge on AI for future societies. So it's not either or, it's both, and that's what I think you lot, and the people particularly on the programme here, but also others who are interested in these issues, will be doing. I think that's what your futures are, okay, is to be doing some of that. So, far from replacing the social sciences, new forms of data and computational methods should be combined with sociological and other forms of domain expertise. The question is, how do we harness that towards the future? How can we build on the possibilities of this combination that I'm suggesting here and push that so we're thinking more about the future? So I'm going to move on to part 2 now, which is Sociologies of the Future. And I want to suggest that if we're going to take this combination of social theory, social methods, sociological, social science, empirical understanding, and combine it with new forms of data and with computational methods to think about the future, there are 3 principles that we should work with. And these principles are drawn, I want to be really clear about this, from a very odd, disparate literature within the social sciences that attempts to address the future. So I've already said mostly social scientists don't like the future much. If you look back over the last 120 years, every now and again, there's a strand of social scientists that start to talk about the future. I'm not going to talk about most of them today because I'm in the middle of writing another paper on all of that and I can't get it all into this lecture. But if we think about, for example, Bloch's work on the sociology of hope, think about Bell and Mao's work on the sociology of the future in the late 60s in the US. If we think about the sociology of expectations, which emerged around the early 2000s, I suppose, and a persistent strand around utopia as well that exists within sociology. I think, next time I come back I'll talk about the other paper, I think we need to learn from each of those, and I think each of those taken together pushes us towards these 3 principles, which I'm just going to mention at a very high level before I start to talk about how we might apply that to the future of AI. So the point is, and if you take one thing from what I've said so far, it is the future's really difficult. Doing it well is really difficult if you're interested in future societies. If you're interested in using some data to predict how many buses will come down University Road in the next hour, that's a different question. Okay, but if you're thinking on a really ambitious way about future societies, it's tricky. These are the principles that I think we need to follow. So these are some of the books that I mentioned, and there's others besides, but these are just some. So John Arry's What is the Future, Sheila Jasanoff's Dreamscapes of Modernity, Ruth Levitas' Utopia as Method, and Aran Apadirai's The Future as Cultural Fact are all fantastic books that seek to do the future without falling into the traps that I've described earlier. They seek to do it in a different kind of way. And when I'm saying these things are woven in and out, none of these, I actually went through the indices of all of these, and I looked to see how many of them referred to each other, and none of them do. I mean, they coexist in a very similar time frame, I think, from maybe the mid-90s to the mid-2000s, something like that. They don't refer to each other at all. I think that's a travesty that they don't refer to each other, and I think it weakens the social sciences approach to the future, that they're so disparate and that they don't try and join together to create something that's more powerful and more of a collective force for thinking about the future. But I would say that, wouldn't I? But there you go. So, first, the future is made from the past and the present. The future is not an empty space. It can't be conjured out of nowhere. However clever your technologies are, you cannot conjure the future out of nothing. Therefore, we must pay attention to what Sheila Jasanoff calls socio-technical thickness. She means really thinking in depth about both technologies and social life, social institutions, social processes, values, cultures. We really need to understand where we are now and how those relationships are now if we're going to think about how we might want to shape the future. It's no good saying, oh, that's the past, we won't think about that, we'll just do something different over here. Because that's not how social change or technical change actually takes place. It's not how socio-technical change takes place. So as Ruth Levitas says, we need to think about how the future will be played out in practice through the design of institutions and the actual processes of everyday life, as well as through the processes of technical innovation. We need to think about both. So the future is made from the past and the present. It's not linear. We know that the past is not a linear trajectory to the present, and the present will not be a linear trajectory to the future. Think of what I just said about the difficulties of predicting the future. If we were on a simple linear trajectory, it would be really easy, right? But we're not. There's disruption, and it's much more complicated than that. So the second thing is how the future is imagined contributes to making the future. Okay? How we actually think about and imagine and project the future is a really important aspect of creating the future. Now, just to be really clear, it's not that we can say, I imagine the future is going to be ABC and next week it's ABC. Okay? It's much more complicated than that, but it is the idea that how we think about what the future might look like shapes, for example, how investment is made, how policy is made, how material artifacts are designed and implemented. These are imaginations about what the future could be like, and they become embedded in material artifacts and in infrastructures and institutional arrangement. That imagination is important. So Appadurai talks about the future as a cultural fact, and Sheila Jasanoff talks about socio-technical imaginaries, and this is her definition of that: collectively held, institutionally stabilised and politically performed visions of desirable futures that at their most powerful just come to seem like what the future is. They just come to seem as if we know what the future is going to be like.
So, I understand that aspect. I worked with Foresight in the year 2000. We were writing that type of institutional prediction. But then I'm also a massive fan of science fiction.
Yeah.
And I wonder how much those writers are thinking about science fiction being a prediction of the future, because there's many, many different stories.
Yeah. I shall come on to science fiction in one moment. Third, who or what shapes the future is an exercise of power. Okay, some people are writing foresight, and that's the position to be in, whether that was in industry or whether it was in government or part of non-governmental organisation. But the ability to shape how the future is imagined is an exercise of power. It creates some things as possibilities and other things as impossibilities. And that is a very powerful position to be in. The question I would ask is who has the capacity to do that? Who is able to mobilise and think about futures? And who doesn't? And Appadurai talks about the politics of possibility and the politics of probability. And for him, the politics of possibility is about mobilising new voices, perhaps marginalised and dominated voices in thinking about the future, to open the possibility for alternative futures that, as Sheila Jasanoff would put it, people would sooner inhabit. So to put it simply, the argument here is that being able to create that imaginary, that idea of what the future looks like, is a very powerful role to take. And if it shapes other people's ways of thinking about the future, if it shapes investment, it shapes policy, it shapes material infrastructures, material artifacts, these are all exercises of power that are not only about the imagination, because they also come to have a socio-material existence as well. And Sheila Jasanoff, she has this idea, which I'll criticise in a moment, but she talks about the emergence of socio-technical imaginaries in 4 phases. So she talks about origins in bright ideas, where people, particularly privileged institutional actors and other individual actors, are able to mobilise a vision of the future. She talks about embedding, where those high-level visions actually become embedded in material technologies or projects, actual facts on the ground, if you like. She then talks about resistance, where there is some controversy perhaps in an A&T kind of sense, or alternative futures that are proposed. There is some politics around the future, and then she suggests at the end that we reach some kind of finished state of the global socio-technical imaginary. She talks about this as a linear trajectory. I want to question that, but I want you to remember origins, embedding, resistance, and then the global socio-technical imaginary. Okay, so got some science fiction up here. So I want to now apply those three principles, first of all, to deconstructing the way in which artificial intelligence is talked about now, and secondly, to thinking about how we might do that differently. So a different approach to the future, artificial intelligence for future societies. So let's begin with how we think about artificial intelligence at the moment. The first thing that is very striking is that how we even think about AI in the present is deeply shaped by the narrative rigidities of the past. The AI imaginary that we have now can be traced back truly to the ancient Greeks, through the Victorians and into the computer labs, particularly of the 1950s and particularly in the US. We see over that time a persistent flipping between utopia and dystopia, and accompanied in recent years by this hype where we go through a cycle of upwards enthusiasm and positivity and great AI is going to save the world, down into disillusion and AI winters, as they've come to be known, like nuclear winters, where all the funding and all the belief and all the faith and all the optimism in those technologies dries up. And you see that with the history of AI over the 20th century in particular. Winter is clearly over. We're not in the winter. I think we may be slightly past high summer, but winter is over and AI is now in some much brighter phase. It's been described, this is in Wired magazine, but I think that's really relevant that this is how it's described there. AI has been described as the era's most critical competition, the flywheel for change. I really like that kind of industrial revolution sort of metaphor that's being used, with global technology giants betting their businesses on it. If we look at some of those global technology giants, this is what they promise. So Intel says that AI promises to transform more than the way we do business. It will touch every corner of society. Microsoft says it will solve the world's most pressing problems. IBM, it's not only going to solve all the problems of today, it's going to solve all the problems of tomorrow as well. And Google says that it's more profound than electricity or fire. So we are certainly in a phase of hype. We are certainly in a phase of optimism, to use slightly less emotive languages, to use a slightly less emotive language. Although there are, of course, dystopian counterpoints. Robots are going to take our jobs. Robots are going to run our governments. Robots are going to take our humanity, as Pauline mentioned at the beginning. With Elon Musk, to remind you, the billionaire who's going to develop the rocket technology to colonise Mars, leading the charge in a very well publicised spat with Mark Zuckerberg over the future of AI. So what we have in that spat between Zuckerberg and Musk is a clash of origins in Jasanoff's terms. Both of them are trying to fire up the imaginary. Both of them are trying to tell us what the future of AI will look like and what it will mean for the future of society. Musk warning us, it's the end is nigh, and Zuckerberg absolutely convinced it's going to cure every evil known to human being. But whilst they fire up the imaginary, actually embedding AI into material artefacts, into institutions, is another question. As Ian Bogost says, when figures like Musk and Zuckerberg talk about artificial intelligence, they aren't really talking about AI, not as in software and hardware and robots. They're talking about words, they're talking about ideas, they're framing their individual and corporate hopes, their dreams and their strategies. The narrative that they use doesn't help. The narrative driven by the big tech companies is driven by certainty. AI will do X, Y, Z. The technology will do this. There is almost no attention whatsoever to what Ruth Levitas calls socio-technical thickness. It is all driven by the promise of the technology with very little attention to questions of funding, of regulation, of how technologies will come into use. When we see the promise that AI is going to solve, and I forget which company it is, but one of them says it is going to solve poverty, global poverty. Now, if we take that seriously for a moment, how is that going to happen? What would it take for AI to solve global poverty? What would it take for AI as part of a socio-technical system to do that? Now, I won't force your brains to try and go there because it's a bit too much, but I would imagine that within the first few seconds you would have come to the conclusion it's going to take more than some algorithms and some data. I'd hope you'd come to that conclusion, at least. The other thing that really doesn't help in this narrative is the term artificial intelligence. The term artificial intelligence is used to describe a whole range of different technologies and a whole range of different approaches. And many of the AI scientists that I talk to now don't really like the term AI at all. In fact, they'd quite like to get rid of it because they think it's become very contaminated by some of this over-the-top, ridiculous kind of promise. The other problem with it is that it evokes ideas of superhuman intelligence, of the singularity, of blah, 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 when in fact, mostly at the moment, AI is the application of maths through computational methods using large data sets. So kind of computational statistics with large data sets. And that's not to dismiss it, okay? These data sets are phenomenal. We don't even really know what is in them. The methods are growing at an extraordinary rate because of the scale of the data sets, the possibilities of processing speed, storage, etc., etc., etc. It's not to dismiss it, but it is not the singularity. It is not what many people think about when they hear the phrase artificial intelligence. So the first points here I'm saying is we need to really think about how these narratives are in play, who's promoting these narratives, what they're for, and move beyond some of the very superficial, high-level claims to certainty that AI technologies will simply end poverty or cure cancer or stop global climate change or whatever it is. And we also need to be really specific about what we mean by AI, because otherwise a huge amount of confusion arises. When I mentioned the application of these data and new computational methods and the promise that they have, I just want to be really clear, I'm leaving to one side now at the moment climate change and curing cancer. That's a different set of questions over here. If we apply these data and these methods to social questions, there has to date been rather limited success. So the kinds of successes that we might point to are recommender systems, for example, or the way in which the web is, the browsers that we use, the search engines rather that we use, are becoming much better at understanding what we're looking for and giving us searches that we want to, results that we're interested in seeing. But there is so far rather limited application to some of the really big social questions around inequality or poverty, or social inclusion, or democratic engagement, or, if we might think of what the big social problems are in the world, it's not clear that big data and computational methods have yet solved those problems for us. Indeed, it's possible that at the moment they might be going off down a direction which is going to do the opposite and maybe worse. And I'm very interested by this talk, and I really recommend that you look at it, by Ali Rahimi, who recently won a Test of Time award at the NIPS conference for his work in machine learning. So he has the credibility as someone who really understands the data and the methods of artificial intelligence. And he likened machine learning, not to fire or electricity. He actually referred to it as alchemy. And he said, alchemy, as we know, works sometimes, but a lot of the time it was really wrong. And what he ends up saying is, that's all right, getting it wrong is okay if you're building a photo sharing website, but we are beyond that now, he says. And he says, I would like to live in a society where systems are built on verifiable, rigorous, thorough knowledge and not alchemy. Now, his concerns are about the methods of machine learning, a very specific set of concerns. And he doesn't say what I'm about to say, but the implications of what he said are that we need to build our knowledge on appropriate sources, on appropriate methods and forms of analysis that help us to address the task at hand. So his concern is that methods are being applied and we don't know why they're working and we don't know where they could go wrong and it could be really dangerous. I would pick up from what he says about using these methods for not just photo sharing websites, but healthcare systems or political systems or really seriously important social and economic and political questions, and to suggest that if we're going to do that, we cannot rely solely on these data and methods, but I'm coming back again to saying that we must integrate that with the appropriate methodological and substantive expertise. That is, if you're looking at political systems, please talk to political scientists. If you're interested in inequality, please talk to sociologists. If you're interested in new business models or transforming markets, please talk to economists, because this is where the substantive domain expertise lies, not in the methods of machine learning, which are really important, but do part of it, not all of it. And his point is this is getting dangerous. More broadly, the impact of artificial intelligence will depend on the uses to which it is put. So far, for all the promises to end climate change and poverty and inequality, the most talked about applications of artificial intelligence, the things that are actually in use now, are rather more mundane. So we have a real dissonance between the kind of future vision of how AI is going to make the world fantastic and the present, where AI is doing all kinds of clever things, but they are perhaps a bit more mundane in the social realm than this bright future. So for all the promises of fire and electricity, in the Google chief exec's talk, he moves from fire and electricity into saying, literally in the same sentence, that's why we built Google Assistant. So these technologies are more important than fire and electricity, so they built Google Assistant. Okay, this is a real dissonance. I'm not getting many signs of one or two signs of recognition, but this seems like a really big jump for me. Google Assistant allows you to have a natural conversation between you and Google. It's one assistant that's ready to help you through your day. So that might be great. I mean, I'm sure people use Google Assistant and it's really, really helpful to those that do, maybe. I don't know. But it is not this transformational social change that's being promised. It is a long way from this transformational future society. Is Google Assistant going to deliver this bright future society? It seems quite unlikely. Possibly we could go with, no, let's not say Elon Musk, but possibly we could be slightly more sceptical than that and talk about the data being generated by Google Assistant and some of the more dystopian concerns that we might have about that. Repeatedly, when we're actually talking about embedding, so remember Jasanoff's origins, embedding, resistance, blah, when we're talking about actually embedding in the present day, we see unreflexive assumptions about who the future is for. If you look, I looked through an article that was published that was the world's 30 greatest AI scientists telling you how AI was going to change the world. I mean, it was a journalistic piece, but they were serious AI scientists. None of them were really talking about social systems. The closest they got was where they said, oh, well, we'd have to talk to social scientists about that, which was great, but they weren't actually doing it. And what we saw over and over again was unreflexive, Western-dominated visions of a future that was about individuals, very privileged individuals, being able to have autonomous vehicles or being able to have personalised healthcare. Okay, so remember what I was saying about objectivity and how knowledge comes from the positions of the scientists where they are. Okay, this is another example. Marx, Weber and Durkheim wrote about the future from their position as white Western men in a rapidly colonising world. They thought the rest of the world would just follow the European trajectory. They didn't even think that India or Southeast Asia, China would be any different. They just made that assumption. And we see that repeat motif here, where we have scientists in AI making claims about what AI will do that is grounded in a very particular position that they occupy in their own lives quite often. That's a bit harsher than I mean. But if we're talking about harsh, let's put this up. So, I don't think it is harsh. But this is Meredith Broussard, who's written a great book called Artificial Unintelligence that you might be interested in. She's a computer scientist. She says most ideas come from a small group of elites who have been imagining and misunderstanding the interplay between technology and society since the 1950s, with marvellous stories of wacky ideas drowning out social ideas and making it impossible to have a proper conversation. And just to add further, Wendy Hall recently wrote, "For the good of society, we cannot allow our world to be organised by learning algorithms whose creators are overwhelmingly dominated by one gender, ethnicity, age or culture." So that's what's wrong with the way that AI and the future are represented at the moment, how AI companies and some AI scientists, not all, represent the future. It's not only, it's deeply troubling, I would say. It's deeply troubling. The question is, what do we do about it? How do we do futures differently? And here I want to think about how we draw on those three principles that I mentioned from the social science literature and try to address the future of AI in a different kind of way. And my starting point is, again, taking really seriously the potential affordances of this new round of AI. I'm not dismissing it for a second. And as we stand on the threshold of these new technical possibilities, I want to argue that we should think about doing futures differently. I want to argue actually that we should be practically more ambitious. So this big disjuncture between the kind of rhetoric up here and the practical embedding, I want to argue that we need to think about embedding in a much more ambitious way. We should be more ambitious than Google Digital Assistant. Actually, we should be more ambitious than autonomous vehicles. We should be more ambitious in seeking to drive the future with a range of voices. So moving beyond Zuckerberg, Musk or whoever, we should seek to drive the future with a range of voices. And I see this less as resistance. So you remember Jasanoff, we might have a bit of resistance on the way. I see it less as resistance which will be wiped out, and I see it more as a really serious opportunity to change the nature of the debate. For those of you who are social scientists, more in a kind of Foucauldian terms, in shaping power relations and how power relations operate around artificial intelligence. Now, I know that this sounds idealistic, but I do want to suggest that we are at a key juncture right now. I think we are at a position, which I would call a privileged opportunity to think about how things could be otherwise. And I say that we're at a privileged opportunity because of NSA, because of Cambridge Analytica, because of Snowden, because of the publicity that is now very public, the public debate about algorithmic bias and algorithmic discrimination. Social questions about artificial intelligence are right now really big news. They're being debated in government, they're being debated by the Royal Societies, they're being debated all over the place. And I think this is a privileged occasion on which we may have the opportunity to change the terms of the debate. I would say that the inevitable logic of AI has been disrupted, the argument that there is an inevitable logic, and it is now clear that AI is not just about scientists in white coats in labs. AI is about political choices, it's about economic inequality, and it's about social responsibility. And this is being discussed now in a way that I think would have been inconceivable at the kind of scale and across the different actors, even 3 or 4 years ago. My worry is it may become inconceivable again in 3 or 4 years' time. I think we have a real opportunity now because, to summarise, I think we're in a big wobble. I think all that certainty is just not so certain anymore, and there is an opportunity for all of us who are interested. I think the AI origin narratives start to seem really fragile. And I'm doing it again. The AI narratives start to seem fragile. And there is a breakage, as Stephen Jackson calls it. He's not writing about AI, but he talks about breakages in the stories of modernity, the technical stories of modernity, that allow us the opportunity, that are generative, that allow opportunities to do things differently. And we are already seeing that being taken up by the Royal Society of Engineers, for example, who have published 2 very interesting reports on AI and ethics. We see it being taken up by government. We can think of GDPR, but we can also think of other innovations. And very interestingly, from my perspective, we see it being taken up by industry. Now, I'm not naive about this, but I speak to insurance companies, telecommunications companies who are really worried about what this wobble means for their business model. Okay? Yes, they may be lovely people who are also concerned about ethics and doing the right thing, and they are also worried about what it means for their business model. And so I think we have an opportunity to engage with all of those actors to think about how AI could be done differently towards the future. So what happens next is really, really important. And I want to just quickly run through, very quickly run through, sorry. I was taking my time because I had longer than usual, but it's okay. Very quickly run through a number of things about what happens next. So, ethics training is a start, right? Ethics training for computer scientists is a start, or for AI scientists. But it is a minimalist place to start. It is really important that AI scientists have training in ethical questions, that they handle the data responsibly, that they're aware of algorithmic bias, etc., etc. But it is only a start. And ethics training of this kind, you know, where you have maybe a half a day training for people working on AI, I'm afraid that what that does is it kind of narrows down all of these very big questions about who the future is for into a set of technical competencies that scientists can just practice in their labs. It doesn't really start to address these really big, broad social questions that I've been raising. It doesn't start to ask questions about whose futures, which futures, how will futures be achieved. It's very narrow. Now, let's broaden out a little bit. The ethical, legal and social implications of AI are important, also called ELSI sometimes by some people. And we're at a moment, I think, where we've gone past ethical training for computer scientists as the solution to the problem. We're now kind of probably in peak ELSI at the moment, where big technical projects, particularly big AI institutions, are starting to invite social scientists in to come and do the ethical, legal and social implications. Turing are very much in this phase at the moment of wanting social scientists to come in and help them with the ethical and legal social implications. Now again, this is a good step forward, but the terms of that inclusion are often rather narrow. So in the ethical, legal and social implications debate, technology usually becomes promise. We've got this great technology and it could do all these things. Ethics becomes, can you develop us something that looks like a consent form or some kind of form that helps us manage our data robustly? So it becomes kind of tick box. And sociologists get positioned as the people who are really negative and say no to everything. Believe me, it's true. I sat down at an event really recently next to somebody who said, "Oh, you're a sociologist, you're just quite negative about everything, aren't you?" It's like, no, we're not, actually. Let me tell you, that's wrong. So this is the problem. And for this reason, some sociologists and some social scientists will refuse to get involved in this space because they believe that there is no possibility to do anything more than be positioned like this. They believe they'll be put in this box and they won't be able to get out of it again. I think that's wrong. I think that ELSI is a Trojan horse, for those of you who know what I mean by a Trojan horse. And I think under that heading, once sociologists and other social scientists are involved in this space, they will push it wide open. I think they will start to ask questions and start to raise issues that will make it very, very hard to go back to those narrow understandings of what ethics is. And I really like, I haven't got time to explain it here, but I really like these two phrases. One is the unintended expectations of AI, and the other one is the anticipatory ethics. Let me concentrate on anticipatory ethics. With artificial intelligence, we cannot say in advance that we've got all the ethical issues signed, sealed and done, because we don't know. We don't know what the ethical issues will be as the data, as the methods, as the applications unfold. And once ethics becomes an ongoing part of the process, rather than something that sits in a university ethics repository somewhere and is never looked at again, the whole situation changes. This moves us beyond questions of moral philosophy, beyond questions of right and wrong at the level of sovereign individuals. That's where we're talking about consent, that's where we're talking about data privacy and so on, towards considerations of care, of fairness, of equality, and of the kind of society that we want to live in. So that's what I mean by saying this Trojan horse. That ethics, I think, is imagined in quite narrow ways by some of these big institutions that work on AI. But once the questions are asked about what's happening with the data, with the methods, and how they're shaping society or could shape society, we have to start asking those much broader questions about fairness, equality, and the kind of society we want to live in. That's how the debate gets pushed wide open. This is I haven't quite finished, but this is my key take home. We should think not only about human futures in the context of rapidly changing technology, but also about technology futures in the context of complex, unequal, and fragile societies. I'm flipping the debate here from saying AI is happening, let's think about what it means for people, to saying let's think about people and what we should be doing with AI, flipping it the other way around. And we need to recognise the complex, unequal and fragile nature of society. I think it's really interesting that AI ethics was debated at Davos this year, for instance, and that goes back to my point about how industry is interested. And one interpretation of that is that the rise of populism and the threat to the liberal democratic consensus has really rattled world leaders. And that there is now an increase. I'm not naive about it. I'm not saying that means they're going to suddenly create an equal world overnight, but I think there is an opportunity to start talking about some of these issues right across the hierarchies and across the fields of the social world, the social, economic and political world. And this recognition that society is complex, it is fragile, it is unequal, and that maybe is not something that we just ignore in Davos or in debates about the future of AI, but something that we have to make central. Okay, so just to kind of start to wind up, what I'm saying is if we want to do the future differently, we are tied together, computer scientists, engineers, sociologists, political scientists, lawyers, management people, possibly health people if we're starting to think about health applications of AI. If we really want to do the future differently, we cannot continue to work in academic silos. We have to work together. And that's really difficult because of the epistemological things, because of the specialist knowledges that we have. It's really difficult and it's really worthwhile. Where we are now with AI calls on us to move beyond, and these are Donna Haraway's words, not mine, but as always, I love her words. It calls us to move beyond comic faith in techno fixes. Oh, don't worry, next time we'll get the technology right. Yeah, we know that one didn't work very well. We know that one caused some problems, but we've got a new one. And we're going to give you a new one, and this time this new technology will work. I mean, that is the narrative of the 20th and 21st centuries, right? We need to move beyond that comic faith in techno-fix, and, let's have a go at the sociologists whilst we're at it, we need to move beyond the fatalism of critique, where, well, it's too late and global capitalism is too powerful, there's no sense in trying to make anything any better. Okay, and occupying that position in between those things, I can tell you, people will throw things at you from both sides, but it's still, I think, the only position to occupy in the circumstances that we find ourselves. And if we do, we may, as Donna Haraway says, find ways to become capable of response, to nurture a new responsibility and to focus on the more serious and lively task of making the future. So, just very, very quickly, how might we actually do that? One thing I would mention at the kind of minimalist end is AI for good. There's a whole series of possibilities where scientists are taking AI capacities and trying to apply them in ways that they believe are for social good. Now, it's still tech solutionism, Okay, it's still, oh, we can do something better with this tech. Don't worry, just leave it with us. We'll fix it. We'll just sprinkle some technology on it and we'll make it better. But number one, it might actually make some things better. And number two, it is a demonstration of how if you embed different values in artifacts and computational artifacts, it problematizes the idea that there's one narrative. It says we could do this differently, and that's a powerful rhetorical strategy as well as something that could achieve change. The second thing I want to mention is speculative design. Speculative design, some of you will know, is not intended to deliver functional systems, but is a way of thinking. It's a kind of thought experiment around thinking about how we could make different futures. How could we design technologies differently? In particular, the pioneers of speculative design are Dunn and Raby in the Speculative Everything book, and what they insist is that we have to understand that technologies don't operate on their own, they come into use in particular contexts, and if we're thinking about the future for technology, we have to think about the institutional and social contexts in which those technologies are going to operate. So start thinking speculatively about future societies and the relationships at a deep level between particular kinds of designs and artifacts and social institutions, everyday practice, cultures, values, who they're for. But thinking about that in a forward-looking way, applying what we know about the past and the present to think speculatively about the future. Ruth Levitas talks about utopia as methodology. She's much lambasted, I think, in British sociology for insisting endlessly that we talk about utopia. And I think most people who criticise her haven't read her books, to be honest, because she's not a utopian. But what she says is, let's imagine how we would like the world to be and then think about what it would take in the present to make that happen. So utopia for her, like Dunn and Raby, is not a destination because she knows that we can't determine the future. But it is a way of thinking differently about the present and thinking what would we do now in order to create a different kind of future, as Jasnov says, futures that people might rather inhabit. So the future is not a destination, but a medium for imaginative thought. And that needs everybody. Again, it needs all of the different disciplinary expertise. And then third and finally, this is really my last point. For any of this to be meaningful, we have to democratise the future. We have to think about how we make the future participatory, how we involve the people and the voices who have not yet been included in the debates about futures. If we're seriously trying to think about what kind of future world we want, that has to involve all of us. It is not good enough to say, leave it to us. Never fear, the academics are here, we will decide what the future is. That's just not good enough for all the above mentioned reasons, right? It's not good enough. So we need to think about how we do that. We have to start with strong and actionable research on the present. We have to understand where we are now, what works well, what doesn't work well, for who, when and why. We have to think about possible futures for specific AI applications, and as I was just saying about Ruth Levitas, we have to think about what would it take to get us where we want to go. If we think, for instance, about two of the things that drive me the most mad in the current debates about AI, autonomous vehicles and robots to care for the elderly. Right? These are presented as solutions to a social problem. Doesn't matter, don't worry, we'll have autonomous vehicles and we'll have robots, problem done, end of. Okay, now I'm not saying that AVs and robots might not be part of that solution, they may well, but what I want to see is serious thinking about how would they become part of the solution. Just putting a robot in a home with somebody or assuming that everybody's going to use autonomous vehicles is not good enough and should not be allowed, in my view. So what outcomes do we want as a society? Do we want old people in their homes with robots? Do we think we don't really want it, but it's better than old people in their homes without robots? How would they be funded? How would they work? How would they relate to people's social networks? How would they... One of the issues we were talking about the other day was, well, should they be material, physical objects? Or if they are, might people just fall over them when they get up out of their chair, and you might cause more problems because people are tripping over robots that are wandering around their houses. Should they be 3D holographic, three-dimensional holographic representation? What I'm asking for is some really serious consideration about how would they work in practice. Who would pay for them? Who would regulate them? What would be the systems that would need to be in place in order to make this work well? So, this means diversifying the vision of the common good. It means it's no longer acceptable for Broussard's AI scientists to come up with wacky ideas about whatever it is. I was going to say the elevator, but I know that's very dearly held by some people, so I won't mention that. What would it take to get more voices and more people involved in all of this? It's really, really difficult, but we do need to think about how we would achieve it. Education is one thing. What do we teach people in schools? What do we teach children about artificial intelligence? What do we teach them about the web or the internet? Is teaching them to code enough? Probably not. It's necessary, I've got nothing against teaching children to code, but is it going to create the anticipatory capacity, the digital citizenship amongst the next generations that will enable them to become part of this future thinking? Probably not. I think what we teach is too little, too narrow, and nowhere near enough to support that kind of capacity in the next generations. Sorry. Beyond education, I think we need methods to build the capacity to aspire amongst all citizens of all ages and in all parts of our communities. Now, how we do that is a really difficult question. John Urry argued in his last book that we should think about extended forms of scenario planning, so we should actually engage citizens, the public, in thinking very directly about the future, not in one-off focus groups, but in long-term and sustainable ways where we think about who those groups are and how we engage them. I think there's real possibility, just to come right back to the beginning, that we could use new forms of data and computational methods, that we could use AR and VR, that we could use visualization, we could use haptics, we could use artificial intelligence in order to help to promote discussions about the future, to help build the capacity to aspire amongst people and social groups who are not the usual suspects. And that's one of the things that we're working on in the University of Bristol. So I think I've talked for long enough. I'm just going to say these things by way of conclusion. There are some big elephants in the room. The big elephants in the room are the big 5 tech companies and China. I shall say no more. I'm not daft, right? I know how powerful they are. One solution is to say they're too powerful, let's do nothing. Another solution is to say they're really powerful, let's do something. Doesn't seem like a very difficult choice to me. And the other thing I want to say, and I don't know that I need to say it, although maybe I do, is that in these interdisciplinary collaborations, sometimes people say, you just want to get rid of the disciplines, you just want to get rid of expertise. That is so far from the truth. We will always need expertise. We will not all become the same. We will always need people who have trained for 10 years in computer science, 20, 30, 40 years in computer science. I'm not going to become a computer scientist. Les probably isn't going to become a sociologist immediately. But the point is that through working in web science and working in other interdisciplinary opportunities that you have now, you can find ways of communicating across forms of expertise. You can build bridges. You can learn enough about what each other does to do something that's different from either of the traditional forms of expertise. And it's that we really, really need to develop AI for future societies. Thank you. Sorry, I went much longer than I thought I would.
Thank you so much, Susan, for an absolutely perfect introduction to the day as well as the week. Really, really thought-provoking, really stimulating the way that you kind of start really right at the beginning and invite people to think about the gradual development and progress of these issues in very, very rich context and with amazing detail. So thank you very, very much. Very stimulating indeed. I'm sure there's lots of questions and comments. So I'd like to throw open the floor. I'm going to ask you to speak into the microphone because if you're happy, the questions are being recorded as well. So can you say who you are and what disciplinary background or interdisciplinary background you're from?
Thank you very much, Professor Halford. My name is Zaina Nazir. I'm a PhD student at University of Southampton, focusing on autonomous vehicles. So I'm an engineer, and I'm really amazed with your presentation and what like I've learned so much today from a sociology point of view. And my question is, you mentioned that we should embed in a more ambitious way in AI. And basically, the question, you also touched on autonomous vehicle a lot as an example. And my question to you is, what I hear and what I see is we are now stuck. I mean, I'm heavily involved in the development of autonomous vehicles, and we are now stuck not in technology, but in legislation, regulation. So I feel like we probably jumped ahead. We went very far in technology, which is my field, but we forgot to speak to you, to speak to sociologists, to talk. I mean, the question is, everything you have suggested and advised, maybe we should have known about it before because we're stuck now. So the first question is, have we had discussions with sociologists in your knowledge or in your experience in autonomous vehicle, because you did give it as an example a few times? Are you aware that there were discussions, collaboration between engineers and sociologists, or did just engineers jump on autonomous vehicle technology and remembered later everything related to how it will impact people's life? Are they really useful? I mean, you said the future should not be fully autonomous vehicles, but we don't know. We cannot control that. We're working on it now. We don't know what the future will bring. So the first question is, was there really collaboration? If not, what are your advice or suggestions in the development of autonomous vehicle? The second question is the ethics. You talk about ethics as training, ethics training in AI as a start. I have issue with the ethics. Who is writing the ethics? So this is my second question about ethics and the development of autonomous vehicle and the collaboration between different scholars, not only engineers and technical people, but also sociologists and other experts. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's really possible for engineering sciences to run ahead of the social sciences. It kind of goes back to that division in the Enlightenment phase, you know, that the engineering sciences has a lot more money, and it has the power of that technological promise, which will be funded. So I think that we see that over and over again, that the engineering sciences are able, and this is no criticism of any of the individuals at all, because you would if you could, right? You know, so it's not a criticism, but because the disciplines are divided into these silos and they're so hierarchical and unequal, I think this happens all the time, and that's why. Because of the power of the techno-optimism, and because of the inequalities or differences between the disciplines, it happens all the time. The second thing is there are people, there's some really interesting work, I'm sorry about this, but at the Bristol Robotics Lab, which I have very little to do with, but they have some geographers actually who are working with them, who are doing some really, really good work on how people would or wouldn't, and under what circumstances people would use autonomous vehicles. So they're looking at a whole range of autonomous vehicles, including public transport and taxis and individual autonomous vehicles and so on. So it's still being driven by that kind of techno-optimism, but it's being moderated by some understandings of who would have access to these vehicles and under what circumstances. You know, don't forget, so they're looking particularly at issues around demographics, of age, of gender, of social class and so on, and funding models as well, how those would be funded. And your third question was about ethics. Yeah, there's a meta-ethics question. So the meta question is how do you write ethics guidelines ethically? You know, and yes, I completely agree with you that they are written from a particular position. And I think we're struggling to keep up with. We have very strong ethics frameworks that we've inherited that developed from medical research in the 1960s that then went through into the social sciences in the 1990s, 80s, 90s, and they were even later in coming into the engineering and computing sciences, and they were premised on a completely different data era. You know, they were premised on a completely different set of data, types of data. It was before any of these kinds of data or computational possibilities. So, yeah, I really agree with you. I suppose the question is it better to try and do something or nothing?
Thank you very much. Next question.
Hi, my name's Nina.
Hi, Nina.
I've come from working for a couple of decades in policy, and currently I'm doing the web science PhD. And I'm afraid I'm going to take you back to science fiction. Just looking back, you were talking earlier about bringing these issues into early education, for example. And just thinking that when I was late primary school, early secondary school, I started reading Isaac Asimov. And I wouldn't have been reading social science articles, I wouldn't have been reading policy papers, but that's how I was getting that knowledge and understanding at that time. And similarly, I know, for example, male technologists who've read Ursula Le Guin, who probably wouldn't read sort of other sort of social science articles. And for me, science fiction is potentially one of those ways in of influencing a wide group of people in society. And I just wondered whether people who are looking at this sort of combination of the sort of social technical approach, we're also talking to science fiction writers about this as well.
They're definitely talking about science fiction and looking at science fiction as method. I don't know whether they're talking to science fiction writers. I don't disagree with you. I would be interested to know how wide the readership of science fiction is and how demographically specific the readership of science fiction is. I mean, I read a lot, right? When I teach my third-year students, or I used to teach my third-year students here, I think I made some really naive assumptions about what anybody read. Oh, everybody's read, Neuromancer, right? They'd never heard of Neuromancer. I mean, I know it's as old as the hills, but they'd never heard of it. They'd never watched Blade Runner. Some of these things that I think really ask questions about the relationships between humans and machines, and have this quite rich imaginary about that has got socio-technical fitness, maybe more social fitness than technical fitness, actually. So I'm very positive about it, and I don't think we should let it happen on its own as a strategy. And I think, I'm not an expert, but I do talk to Nick Gibbons sometimes, who is an expert about science fiction, and he's been recommending some things for me to read, and he'll say, oh, well, this is the only book by a black woman science fiction writer that's ever won a prize. So there's still questions there about whose futures are being represented in science fiction, but as a potential method, I think it's exciting. I think I did some work once with year 6 primary school children, and it was around telemedicine when I was doing that work in Norway, and we got them to design the hospital of the future. And their designs were incredibly uninspiring, actually. It was all kind of flying hospital tables and things, and flying ambulances. That was a big thing as well. But it's not so much what they imagined that was the important thing, it was having a conversation with them and thinking about anticipation. I'm really interested, I don't know very much about it, this notion of anticipatory capacity, I think, is a really interesting one. I don't like the normative implication of it, that somehow you could have 100% anticipatory capacity, or somehow you're kind of filling up with anticipatory capacity. I don't like that idea. But the idea that the future is not just for the privileged. And this is why Arjuna Padjarai's book is so great, because he talks about the everyday future practices of homeless people in Mumbai, actually. That's what his book is based on. And I think there's a lot to be learned from that.
Mine's less of a question, actually, and more of a comment that I'd be interested in on your response to. Because the big event has been Cambridge Analytica. And it's interesting that the one person that seems to have made really public the problem with using AI with personal data is a journalist. And we've been lucky that she's really taken up the fight. She's done a very thorough investigation, culminating in the documentary that was on, I think it was Netflix, wasn't it? Was it Netflix that aired it very recently? So it's, as I said, it's less a question and more a comment. How do you feel about a journalist being the one who's really making this story stick and really raising raising the profile of this issue? It's not coming from science, it's coming from a journalist who's managed to get it into the popular media.
I think it's great. I mean, I don't think it's got to be academics or journalists. I think there'll be points at which different kinds of research, academic research is very different to journalistic research. Are you talking about Carol Cadwallader?
Yes, Carol Cadwallader, yeah.
But I mean, you could go back to Glenn, forgotten his name. So, I mean, they have the opportunity to do that in ways that academics don't. They have different timescales, they have different resources and funding. You know, I think we should work together. Don't really have anything else to say apart from that.
As a media, so you probably know I used to teach media studies, and it's been really interesting how some of these really big and very interesting stories that anybody can understand has slipped from the popular media. And I know there's all sorts of political reasons for that. You only need to look at who actually owns the media to realise why these stories aren't getting there. But I'm really pleased that we have someone like Carol Cadwallader who is raising the profile of some of these issues.
It's not just her, there's quite a lot of journalists doing that, I think. And I think, for example, it's one thing to talk about algorithmic bias or something like that. It's another thing to actually really have the time and the opportunity and the sort of intellectual, the training to be able to understand how that operates or to come up with some real examples of it. You know, so that might take years to do, and journalists aren't going to be very interested in spending years in doing that or have the resources or the capacity to do that. So, you know, there's a division of labour, right? We could get into a discussion about public intellectuals and all the rest of it, but...
Any more questions or comments?
Hi, Susan.
Hi, Claire.
What would you tell a 14-year-old who was going to go off and do a hairdressing course or do a bricklaying course? What do they need to know
About?
AI and the future that they're going into?
I mean, that's a big question. The two things that spring to my mind that really need working through. I mean, one is, and there's some really good examples in web science of PhDs that have been around education for various labels are used, but web citizenship or whatever. And you think about Michael Day's work or Hugh Davies' work, for example, which have tried to develop alternative curricula in which you don't just teach people to code, you don't just teach people that the internet is just a free kind of information superhighway, but that you start that there should be some kind of basic civic education around data harvesting, data reuse, data broking, the system that young people, like it or not, are in. I don't think it's only about questions of privacy and security, although I think those are important. There's a broader political economy, I suppose, the political economy of data and the data infrastructures. At some level, I think it's like we should know how to vote, or we should know what our rights are if we're arrested. I think we should understand that we're generating data and data are being used in these ways and that kind of area. I think the other thing, and this is not what they should know, rather than it's more of the disposition or the capacity to not feel powerless and useless in the face of the future. I mean, I know that sounds naive and hugely ambitious, but not to think, oh, the future's for other people, or nothing I say is relevant or of any interest, or it's going to happen anyway with or without me. I mean, we all feel those things sometimes, right, or a lot of the time. But I think building that sense of engagement with the future is what I would want to aspire to. I don't quite know how they're going to get taught that, but... You know. Actually, I mean, Michael Day's PhD, he'd actually developed a web science curriculum, and he taught it, I think, in years 7, 9 and 11. And it's really, really interesting, all the empirical detail on how the students in those 3 years responded to that.
I think, sorry, so if I can
finished, yeah.
sort of comment on that. When I first heard your question, I was thinking, oh yes, well of course, sort of people who go into hairdressing or bricklaying, they're not going to be part of this. This is not for them. But of course, hairdressing, if you're a hairdresser, what you're dealing with, you're effectively a style consultant. This is all mediated through Instagram and YouTube nowadays. And I don't know what people are taught at hairdressing college. And what skills they get apart. And clearly they're taught how to cut people's hair and style them. But I'm a man. I've never really experimented very far with the range of options available.
Could be your future list.
But this is, and similarly for people who are builders, this is a heavily this is an area in which regulation is high, and which information about properties and the how you decide about who owns what, and sort of where boundary walls are, and what loads are on which particular walls, and sort of what materials are allowed in which in which contexts, in which houses, and for what purposes. All of this is is very sort of information heavy, and so I can only imagine that that we will be expecting even at sort of the things where we're not saying, oh, you're going to go to university and do an MSc in sort of AI, but your NVQ courses will expect you to know how to integrate with these systems, work through with these systems, or that these systems exist, and how
Yeah, I really agree. And one of the things I've been thinking about recently is about cybersecurity skills, and breaking away from the idea for two reasons, that cybersecurity skills are only for people who've got MSCs or postdocs in cybersecurity, because actually, of course, you need those things, but if you're looking at embedding safe practices across organisations, they need to be held by people who don't have the MSCs and aren't doing the high-level kind of design invention work. They need to be done by people perhaps who are data entry people, for instance, or so some of the things around employee-driven innovation, actually I've been thinking about it in that context, and spreading skills across the labour market and across the workforce. And that's partly in the context that I've been talking, because it's about empowering, right? But it's also about effective, in the case of cyber, it's about creating effectively resilient and safe organisations that people work in. I was talking to a cyber person the other day, and he does all this stuff on cyber for large infrastructures, cybersecurity for large-scale infrastructures, and he was showing me a mock-up of a water treatment plant, because they were trying to attack this water treatment plant and see how they could do it. And they had the panel on the front, and he said they'd learnt recently that 9 times out of 10, when the panel said something was going wrong, the operators assumed it was something wrong with the panel, so they took it off and put a new one on. And that's because the skills were not embedded across the workforce. These sort of things are designed, Pauline and I are really used to this in the work that we've done in the past on organisational change, designed at the top, and you sort of think, oh, just pop that in there and everything will be fine. But organisational change and organisations only happen because people animate them, people do them, people make them live. And so I think spreading skills in that way would be really good for business and for organisational effectiveness and success, as well as for individuals' own understanding and sense of engagement with and authority in a digital age. Well, I'm echoing what you're saying, really.
Yeah, I think that's kind of really important. And, the questions are really, really interesting ones. And actually, hairdressing and bricklaying are very different sorts of occupations. And I think my answer to my contribution to this would be that they're quite good exemplifiers of actually how things might change as we go forward, and it's highly likely. I've just spent sort of 3 months in the engineering industry, and it's highly likely that bricklaying as an occupation will die out. It will be manufactured, in some kind of plant, and then whole walls will be shipped and constructed, and houses will be put together on site. But that's not to sort of say that there won't be a whole range of very interesting and kind of exciting occupations within construction. Those kind of occupations may change in the kinds of skills that are demanded with them. And it won't all be high-level skills, because obviously one concern is with people have all different levels of skills. So, I think this idea that it's all going to be high-level skills, and that people with lower skills levels are going to be edged out of the labour market. I don't see that that's going to be the case at all. And in fact, in many ways, there's going to be huge space for social skills, explaining skills. So that's the hairdressers. The hairdressers, you don't only go to the hairdresser to have your hair cut. You often go to the country camp and have a nice chat and, sort of
Might be gendered.
Social space. So those are kind of quite different types of jobs. So, I think we do have to harness young people with the idea that jobs are going to change and skills requirements are going to change, and the flexibility to kind of deal with that. But that's not necessarily a huge concern. It doesn't mean, there's no jobs for you in the future. It's just that the content of those jobs and the skill levels, will be constantly changing. Any more questions or comments? I know it's been very, very stimulating.
got too
Lots
much
of
time.
very, very big ideas to sort of carry you through the week. And Susan, are you going to join us at lunch?
Yeah.
Yep, so Susan will be around at lunch. I think lunch is just outside in the foyer. So hopefully we can carry on talking and debating as we munch our sandwiches. Thank you very much. Thank you, Susan. Thank you.